as well, but this should work. So that's working now.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Don't worry, you're amongst friends.
Perfect. All right. So here is what we're talking about: identifying risks and then mitigating your risk overall to avoid those claim situations, to avoid the lawsuit situations. Okay. So when we look at your risk, we look at prioritizing it. And there's two parts to risk, right? There's the severity of a claim event, of a lawsuit, and there's the probability that it will become, that you will have that claim event. One thing we'll look at is overall, the probability of having a claim or a lawsuit is much higher on residential projects than it is on commercial projects. The claim statistics bear that out. We see far more claims across residential work for architects. We'll look at some of the reasons behind that. The other side of that, though, you want to think about is what's the potential severity of having a claim there? And so at the bottom, you have personal liability. So if you're a stamping architect, if you stamp drawings and there's a lawsuit, if you don't have professional liability insurance, or if your professional liability insurance is, let's say the limit is $500,000 and the lawsuit is $2 million, potentially you can be personally liable as an architect. Even if you have an LLC, that doesn't protect you. You can be personally liable as a stamping architect. And so they can come after you personally, your house, your desk, your chairs, all of that, something we naturally want to avoid. The second thing there in terms of evaluating severity is you have financial losses. And so even if you do have a professional liability policy, it's very possible that you have a deductible on that policy. Deductibles are per claim. So if you have a couple claims in a calendar year, let's say you carry a $10,000 per claim deductible, each time you have a claim, the first $10,000 comes out of your pocket in terms of paying for that claim. And then the final thing, and honestly, probably the most important thing in my view, is damage to your reputation. I think most firms I talk to when we do this tell me that their work, they'd say 70 to 90% oftentimes is either repeat or referral business, right? It's either working with the same customers again, or it's that customer that's referred you to someone else. And so if you have a claim situation, a lawsuit situation, that damages your reputation, certainly. And so for one thing, you're probably never working for that client again. You probably don't want to work for that client again if they've just sued you. And then the second thing there is you're probably not getting any referrals. And that's really difficult to quantify, right? Is you can't say that, party A might have referred party B, party C down the line. It's really difficult to quantify. But what we see in practice is that firms that have claim situations, especially more publicized claim situations, is they don't get that referral business. And we see revenues often drop for a few years following a big claim. All right, so in terms of mitigation, your risk keeping levels low overall, we look at four basic tenets there. Now, the first one is avoidance of risk. So the first thing you need to do is evaluate the project and evaluate the client, and that's really important. So what do you guys think? Do you think you can avoid risk entirely on any project? Yes, no?
No.
No, it's a trick question. It's a rude way to start. The only way to do it, you can do it. The only way to do it is to not take that project, right? Any project you take, there's an element of risk, but you are in the driver's seat before you take that project. And, that's easy for us to say, right, from our insurance ivory tower, you should turn down work. And it's easier sometimes when the market's doing better and there's more out there. But that's really important. We tell people all the time, sometimes the best projects are the ones you don't take. I can't tell you how many times we have a claim situation. Someone calls me and they say, hey, Cam, we got a lawsuit on this project. It's been fraught with issues throughout the project. I should have known better up front. I talked to these people up front. I saw the warning signs, right? Their attorneys were heavily involved from the get-go in the contract negotiations. They weren't reasonable. We never should have taken this project. And at the end of the day, we'll look at the costs associated with having one of those claims, because you can look at what your fees would have been on that project versus the time you spend with attorneys, potentially the settlement costs. So one of the best things you can do, one of the key things, and we'll look at how to do this, is evaluate your clients up front, because it's important to be able to say no at points when you see those red flags. That way you can avoid the risk entirely on those projects. Second thing you do is you transfer your risk. So you have the professional liability insurance. Again, you transfer your risk onto the insurance carrier. They will step in and pay if there is a claim. The second risk transfer mechanism is your contract. So hopefully you're getting a written agreement on all of your projects. When we have a claim come in, when we have a lawsuit come in, the very first thing I'll ask you for is a copy of your contract, because I want to see what you committed to, what was your scope of services, what was the indemnity clause? Did you have a limitation on your liability? That's all really important stuff. And so at the heart of it, the contract negotiation is a risk transfer discussion, a risk allocation discussion, where you want to have the risk allocated to the appropriate parties, like job site means and methods. That's a risk that should be with the contractor. That is not something that should be with the architect. That should be addressed in the contract. Sometimes there's clients that are unreasonable in the contract negotiations, and they want you to take on all the risk, right? Maybe it's a relatively small project. Let's say the fee is $5,000, but the client doesn't want to give you any limitation of liability. They want you to potentially be liable for $5 million or whatever the value of the structure is, right? I would say that's maybe an unreasonable client, or it's a client you at least want to evaluate further. So in terms of transferring your risk, the contract is really important. That's why it's so important to have a good contract and a signed contract so that we can have it enforced. The third thing, you assume some level of risk, right? You have that deductible on your professional liability policy. Above your professional liability limits, let's say you carry $1 million limits, above that, you're self-insuring. That's potentially you on the hook for those additional costs. And then the last thing is risk control. And this is where really, at its most basic, it's looking at the mistakes of others, learning from those mistakes so you don't get yourself into the same sort of situations. And that's where we'll go through some of those pitfalls today. Okay. In terms of looking at your risk, every year you go through the professional liability application process. You might have a multi-year policy, but typically you'll go through it every year. And what you do is you figure out your target risk level, right? And we work with you on that. You can think of, hey, I'm doing larger projects. Maybe I should carry higher limits, or the firm has grown. Maybe we should take on a larger deductible. That's a conversation you always want to have. And that's changing, right? I mean, construction values the last couple of years have gone through the roof. So we've seen a lot of firms have to increase their limits just because they look at the construction values on the total projects they have out there, and they've ballooned the last few years. In terms of the cost of risk, a lot of people think the cost of risk is my insurance premium, which is expensive. Professional liability insurance is not a cheap policy to have. A lot of people think that is the cost of risk in being an architect. That's not really the case, though. And so we'll look at here, what are the hidden costs of risks for architecture firms? So we use the image of an iceberg, and above the surface, you have the direct cost to your firm, right? That's that deductible. Let's say you have a $5,000 deductible. Direct cost, you have a lawsuit, you pay the first $5,000. It's easy to see, it's easy to quantify. Beneath the surface, though, there's additional costs. So what's the revenue required to offset the loss? So let's say you have a $5,000 deductible. If we're working on a 10% margin, let's say here for the sake of this, you now have to work on a $50,000 fee job, essentially for free, to make that back, right? 50,000 fees. The larger the deductible you have, the larger job you now have to work on for free to make that back. Further and bigger than that, though, is the time in dealing with the problem. So these claim situations, the average claim situation, I would say, takes anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years to finally sort itself out. I mean, we're talking legitimate lawsuits at this point. There are some that take far longer than that. I was doing this at a big firm, it was probably 6 months or so ago at this point, and they had a claim just wrap up on a university project that actually started in 2012. So they finally wrapped it up in 2022. The principal I was talking to over there said he estimated he spent 2,000 to 3,000 hours dealing with that claim situation over the years. that is a massive amount of time. That's time you don't get back. That's time you can't bill for, right? You can't be billing the client that's suing you at that point for that additional time. And so there's a lot of time associated in dealing with this. Time going back and forth with attorneys, looking back through your old emails, looking back at old drawings. It's a lot of time, and it's time you're not billing. Oftentimes, honestly, it ends up being personal time because you have to keep working on your other projects during the day. So at night, on the weekends, that's when you end up dealing with these things. And it's not a fun way to spend your nights or to spend your weekends. And what we sort of see from that too is in spending so much time dealing with the problem, we see other problems start to arise. So it happens all the time where we see an architecture firm that hasn't had a claim in 10 years, right? And they have one claim and it starts to pull a lot of the principal's time away, a lot of attention away. And so the quality control isn't there on their other projects. And so we start to see a domino effect. We see 2, 3, 4 claims in the next 5 years because the principals or project managers, whoever it is, are spread so thin because of the time they're spending on that claim, they don't have the time to do their normal procedures on the other projects. So there's that domino effect there. And then finally at the bottom, we talked about this. This is the biggest thing for me is loss of your reputation, because it can really be crippling for a firm, especially when you look at your repeat and referral business, if it's 70, 80, 90% there. All right, so to give you an idea of the average time you spend dealing with one of these lawsuits, the current average, we're actually going through and running this analysis again, so I expect this to be higher when we get this through next time. The current average, though, is 200 hours spent dealing with a lawsuit. Again, that's a lot of time. That's time you can't be billing, so you have that cost, but it's also a very unpleasant couple hundred hours. Okay. So we'll get into the risk drivers here. And so when we look at risk drivers, what we're talking about is causes leading to a loss prevention file or a claim being made. So we talked about a claim, right? That's the demand for money or services. That's the formal lawsuit you receive on a project. A loss prevention file, though, good insurance carriers will offer what's called loss prevention services, and good insurance carriers should have unlimited loss prevention services. And what that is it's a precursor to any claims. So there might be a project where fingers are starting to get pointed, right? The costs have gone way over. There's been large delays because the windows didn't come in on time. The cabinets are taking 6 months, whatever it is, right? Fingers are starting to get pointed. People are upset. And you're just anxious at that point. There's no claim, there's no lawsuit, but you're anxious. What you can do is you can open a loss prevention file with your insurance carrier. And what that does is you give us a call, we talk to the insurance carrier, and they'll assign counsel, they'll potentially assign an attorney to you to help you just behind the scenes navigate the situation so that it doesn't turn into a claim. And it's something that really everyone should take advantage of. It's no cost to your policy, no cost to your deductible. And it's in the benefit of the insurance carrier too, right? Because they're protecting their checkbook at the end of the day. If this doesn't blow up, they won't have to pay out on it. But it's really important to report those and to report things early too. There's no penalty for it. So it's a really useful tool to have in your insurance carrier. I think one of the examples that I often use in terms of a loss prevention file is the examples of windows on a residential project. So maybe you've spec'd certain windows for this project. It's a project near the coast, and you think there needs to be a certain level of window in this house. Now the client sees the bill, the potential bill for the windows, and they say, whoa, maybe we don't need these high-end windows, right? They want to cut costs somewhere, and the window bill had their jaw drop, so they want to cut some costs. You think it's probably a bad idea to do that given the location on the coast, but it's not an issue in terms of code. It's not an issue in terms of the standard care, right? It meets the standard care, it meets code. You just don't think that's a good idea. So what you can do is you can open a loss prevention file, and the insurance company behind the scenes, they'll have an attorney help you write an email essentially that says to the client, you can move forward with the change in the windows that you've requested, but if you do so, you release us from any and all liability stemming from making that change. So it's really useful. You can guess. Oftentimes we send that email to the client, and the client all of a sudden no longer wants to make that change because they realize that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But that's the difference between a loss prevention file and a claim. It's really a precursor to a claim, and it's just a service that the insurance carriers provide. All right, so when we look at claims, we look at lawsuits, there's usually two factors, right? There's the technical side of things and there's the non-technical side of things. The technical side of things, you think of the actual error or omission in your design documents. You omitted flashing somewhere, you made a mistake in your design documents. That's the technical error. I can't help you with that. What I can help with is the non-technical side of things. And so what we see is that most claims, 7 out of every 10 claims, have a non-technical factor that contribute to the claim being made. So it's a business practices issue, right? You didn't document things correctly, your communication was poor with the contractor, something like that. That's what actually drives a claim. If you think about it, there's errors and omissions probably on every project you work on, I would guess, to some extent, right? And 99% of the time, you work with the owner, you work with your consultants, you work with the contractor. Everyone figures it out. You move forward. There's no lawsuit filed. You just move forward amicably. You get it done. Someone eats cost maybe, but it gets done. That 1%, maybe less, that something turns into a claim, that's when there were probably some issues in terms of how you handled the project throughout. Not necessarily just in your drawings, but how you handled the project. And so that's what we'll look at today, is those business practices issues that end up causing claims. Okay, so this one we talked about there. So in terms of looking at those non-technical business practices issues, we've broken it down into 6 main drivers here. So the way to look at this is we're looking at it's roughly 2,500 professional liability lawsuits or claims that went into this data. So what we've done here is for each claim, we've picked it up, we've looked at it, and we've said, what caused this claim principally, right? Was it client selection? Did they pick a bad client? Was it a communication issue? And we've tried to drop each claim into one of these 6 buckets so we can analyze where most firms are having their problems come up. So those are the top 6 in terms of the claims. Client selection, again, who are you working with? Did you do the correct evaluation of your client up front? Construction phase services. Were you allowed to do construction phase services, right? Did the client trim that because they were trying to save money at the end of the day? Or were the construction phase services agreed to in the contract over the top, right? In terms of the construction phase, you are only out there to check for general conformance with your design documents. Oftentimes the clients do not understand that, do not want to understand that. Whatever it is, they think you're detail checking, standing over the shoulder of the contractor, making sure everything is perfect. So construction phase services, making sure that's right in the contract, and then performing those services correctly too. We'll talk about each of these a little bit more in depth. Project team capabilities, who are the people you have on the project internally and externally, sub-consultants too. Communication, right? Communicating with the owner, communicating with the contractor, consultants, the owner's consultants, negotiation and contracts, negotiating those good contracts, those insurable contracts and fair contracts. And then the last thing is quality management, having a quality management procedure and following that procedure each and every time. All right, any guesses as to which one of these drives the most amount of claims for architects, especially in the residential world?
CA, construction phase?
CA, and why do you think construction phase?
It's the one that they always try and cut people out of, and the one where, especially HVAC, would I think drive a lot of issues. Yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing, or that, or contracts, or negotiation and contracts, and you just have a bad contract.
Absolutely. And so the construction phase, right, we see a lot of claims come in during the construction phase. That's sort of where the rubber meets the road there, and we end up having the claims filed there. So absolutely, the construction phase can cause problems. And then negotiations and contracts too. If you sign a bad contract, or you sign a contract where you don't have a tight scope, it's too broad, or Worse, you sign an uninsurable contract, a contract that is not covered by your insurance. That can cause big issues. And all contracts are not covered by your insurance. Professional liability policies have what's called a contractual liability exclusion. And what that is it's an exclusion that says that the insurance carrier doesn't have to cover a claim if you have committed to something that you would have not been held to in the absence of a contract. So pretty much, if you didn't sign a contract, you would be held to the prevailing standard of care in the area, right? Performing to the same level as another architect would, practicing the same or similar locality on a project of same or similar size, scope, and complexity. That's what you're held to. If you sign a contract that says you will perform to the highest standard of care, or you will produce error-free design documents, that's significantly elevating your standard of care, and that would trigger the contractual liability exclusion on your professional liability policy. So that's really important too. All right, any other guesses on this? Usually I have prizes, so maybe next time we'll do this in person and I have prizes to drive some more guesses, but anyone else on these?
I'm going to throw in communication.
Okay, and why communication?
I think it's the most, they're the most gray areas about how emails are interpreted, when emails go out, if they go out. I just think it's where we fail just as human beings, being able to communicate accurately. And I don't think it's any different in an architecture project.
No, I think you're right. In communication, if you think about any project that you work on, there's probably thousands of pieces of communication that go back and forth, whether it's emails, phone calls, in-person meetings. So it's critically important that you communicate well. As I said, kind of as the architect on the project, there's multiple parties that you need to be communicating with. You communicate with the owner, communicate back with the contractor, coordinate with your consultants. The owner might have consultants that you need to coordinate with too. So communication is really key. And honestly, in a lot of ways, it's only become more difficult with people doing things more remotely. You're not having those in-person meetings. It leaves more room for potential miscommunications. So communication certainly drives a good amount of claims. All right. So which one is it? So it's 4. Communication is number 1 in terms of driving the most amount of claims. 30% of overall claims are affected by communications related issues. And now it's tough though too, right? Because if you look at any one given claim, there can be 3 or 4 of these that actually contribute to you having a lawsuit situation. You might have picked a crummy client. Because of that, they proposed a bad contract. They didn't communicate well throughout the process, and they didn't understand what your responsibilities were during the construction phase. Right, so there can be layers to it, but communication overall drives the most amount of claims. So here's a breakdown by claims count. So 30% of overall claims caused by communications related issues, 18% caused by construction phase services issues. Just below that, client selection at 16%. Just below that, project team capabilities driving 14% of claims. Quality management driving 12% of claims, and then negotiations and contracts driving 6% of the overall claims we see. So when we look at claims, again, we think of it 2 ways. We think of frequency and severity. So this is the gauge of frequency. So now if we look at severity, what's the average cost of one of these claims? So communications related claim, the average cost is $590,000. So fairly expensive, right? And you have to think on any of these figures we're looking at here, this includes both settlement costs, actually having a payout or a settlement, but it also includes attorney's fees. And attorneys are not getting cheaper. Attorneys charge by the hour. And so those really stack up. I mean, sometimes we'll have a claim situation where we end up with a $500,000 settlement, but we paid $375,000 on attorney's fees because it took us a couple of years to get there. So it adds up. You end up with an $875,000 claim in that situation. Construction phase services, Our average is 610,000 in terms of the average claim size for that. Client selection, it's kind of in that same realm, 650,000 there. Quality management, what do we think? Do you guys think it's higher or lower than these three? Up, down? 50-50 shot on this one.
Higher.
Higher? All right, so this one's a little bit lower, and it's interesting. The reason on that one is we typically don't spend a lot on attorney's fees for quality management claims. I often call these oops claims. It's you call and say, hey, Cam, we missed this. You know, we screwed this up. It was an issue, and we end up just writing a check pretty much. So those ones are actually slightly lower. Any guesses on project team capabilities, higher or lower in terms of the cost of a claim where you don't have the right people on the project? That one's higher, a lot higher. So it's really important to have the right people on the project. You can look at a circumstance where maybe you're doing a high-end custom home and on the coast somewhere, right? And you hire a structural that has mostly worked on office projects, right, in the city or something like that. Well, that's probably not the best fit for this project. They may be very experienced. They might have been, licensed structural for 30 years, but they don't have experience on this project. And what we see is that having the wrong folks on the project causes really expensive claims. And so the important thing there to kind of consider is the more you can work with the same subconsultants again and again, the better, because you develop that relationship of trust with them. They trust you. The communication is there as well. You have to think that as the architect, your contract is directly with the client. If you have your subconsultants under you, you are responsible for the acts and omissions of your subs. And so if there's an issue, even if it's very clearly a structural engineering issue, the client has to go through you to get to the structural. So they'll be suing you to get to the structural. So that's the importance of having the right folks on the project.
Can I ask a question about that? We are increasingly finding, for a number of reasons, that consultants are just going direct to the client. Oftentimes it's because our basic contract includes a markup, and they're kind of like, why do we need a markup if we're paying you hourly? And just in my general experience, knowing that, like, if the HVAC, which also in my experience tends to be the thing that people end up having the most problems with at the end of the project, like if they've got that design build guy direct to them, they're kind of like, the risk gets transferred to, like, literally to them, because I just remember in all the seminars that I've taken on this stuff that, like, if the lawsuit is actually about the HVAC system and they were direct to you, then they've got to go through me, which makes my life more of a pain. And if they are direct to the client, I mean, I may be involved, but I may be less directly impacted, as it were. So if this is an increasing trend, what is that, or increasing requests from our clients, what does that do on our end? Is it good for us? Is it indifferent to our liability? If we've recommended them, could you talk a little bit about that impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword for architects historically, because for one, when you have the engineers or whatever consultants contracted directly to the owner, as you said, if there's an issue, they go directly after them and they can keep you out of it, which is great. Where architects in the past haven't wanted to let that happen, it's been for a couple of reasons. One, there's that markup. Architects wanted to get the markup on things. And then two, some architects have looked at it and said, I won't have as much control over the project. I won't have the control I want if I'm not controlling, potentially the payment and the communication to the subs, if they can communicate directly, if their payment is coming directly. And so their view is that there might be more miscommunication, and that might cause more issues. From a liability perspective, looking at it from our perspective, it's always cleaner if they go direct, right? And there's certain circumstances where, like I would tell you, a geotech, you always want them to go direct with the owner. You never want to have the geotech under you. There's Geotechnical claims, we see a good amount of them. They're typically large, fairly large claims too. Sort of the same thing for structurals, honestly. They have bad claim statistics in terms of severity and frequency. So those are two that typically people go direct, but really it's up to the firm. And so if you think you can still manage the project adequately, that there won't be communications issues, and if you're comfortable foregoing the markup on it, then from my perspective, the liability is certainly lower having them contracted directly. And so if I say, if you're comfortable doing it, if you're comfortable with the communications, then definitely, I think that's a good idea to do.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, so the last one here, negotiations and contracts in terms of the severity of claims. Very high. All right, so we saw that negotiations and contracts only cause 6% of the overall number of claims we look at against architecture firms, but in terms of their cost, they are the most expensive. And so, you know, the thing I look at here again is that standard of care. Anytime you sign a contract with an elevated standard of care, that's potentially going to be a very large claim, because and it can be just, as I said, as basic as one word, right? They can just stick the word highest in there. Or what I see in a lot of contracts is owners will, instead of tying it to your locality, they'll say you'll perform to the level of a nationally recognized firm, right? Something like that. Now we have a claim come in, we have a lawsuit come in. First thing we do again, we'll look at your contract. I see that you signed a contract that commits you to the highest standard of care. Even worse, right? You sign a contract that says you will deliver error-free or defect-free design documents. Well, now our attorneys don't just have to prove that you perform to the level that another architect would practicing in the same or similar locality. We have to prove that you perform to the quote unquote highest level, or that you performed error-free, or that you performed to that nationally recognized level. That makes it really difficult for us, and it makes it really easy for the other side, right? Because that bar is so much higher for that standard of care that we have to show that you perform to. And so that's one of the most important things in contracts is the standard of care. And that's why, you know, in your contracts, those claims can balloon. The other thing we look at in contracts is it's critical to have a waiver of consequential damages in your contracts. And so if there's a claim, there's two types of damages, right? You have your direct damages. Those are easily quantifiable. Maybe we have to redo some design work. Maybe there's X amount of cost to redo the system that was designed incorrectly. That's a direct cost, a direct damage. Consequential damage is further than that. That's loss of use, loss of rent, loss of income. And so you want to have a waiver of consequential damages in your contract that says you will not be on the hook for those consequential damages. It's a standard waiver in AIA agreements. In the B101, it's 8.1.3, but it's in all the AIA agreements, and it's something you should be able to get across in your agreements, because in practice, what we see is claims with consequential damages end up being far more severe in terms of the overall cost. There's some projects you can't even take on without a waiver of consequential damages. So, you know, you think about the Wynn Casino that just went up in Everett, right? What are the consequential damages every day that that casino doesn't open on time? What's the revenue they would make? It's millions of dollars. You put an architecture firm out of business quickly taking on those damages. There's a big exposure in the residential world too, though. You know, if it's rental units, what's the loss of rental income? If it's condo units, you know, they've seen the argument where, hey, now the market has gone down X% and you're on the hook for the delta because there were delays and we couldn't get these on the market when we wanted to. Single family home, I kid you not, the insurance carriers end up renting nice single family homes on the Cape and the Vineyard every year pretty much, because an architect is designing a project down there. The family wants to move in June 1st for the summer. They don't get to because there's been delays on the project. And now there's the consequential damage of, hey, we were expecting to have a place to stay. We don't. And so now we have to find a place for them to stay of like quality. It's a $5 or $10 million home. The rent's going to be pretty expensive for a few months of that. So in your contracts, that's another key thing to have, is a waiver of consequential damages. In terms of your contracts, I figure many of you are probably working off your standard terms and conditions. You know, if you ever get pushback from a client Feel free to send that over. I look at, actually, I looked at 547 contracts last year. So spent a lot of time looking at architectural agreements, and I'm always happy to take a look at it. I'll get it back to you in 24 hours with my comments. Make sure there's not anything too onerous in there for you. All right, so we'll dive into each of these a little bit more in depth here. You know, we got about 15, 20 minutes here, and I'll let you get out of here. Communications, the biggest thing here is lack of documentation, or not documenting things you should document. Now, architects can also sometimes document things that they should not be documenting. We do a whole hour seminar on the do's and don'ts of email practices for architecture firms. It's a big issue that we've run into the past few years. All emails are discoverable. So if you get into a lawsuit situation, the other side, through the discovery process and their attorneys, they're going to pull all of your emails, and they're going to find any email that you sent associated with that project. They're extremely good at finding emails too. Even if your inbox is in disarray and you can't find your own emails, they can probably find it. And they do a pretty good job of it. And so email is really important because, I tell people email is essentially written in pen. Anything you put in an email will probably come back to you at the end of the day in a lawsuit or a claim situation. So you have to be really careful about what you put in emails. What we'll do is we'll jump through. Next slide has a few examples of real emails sent by architects in claim situations. There's some from engineers in there too that have gotten folks into trouble. We can talk about what not to do in terms of your emailing. So the first one, we don't have enough qualified professionals to staff this project. Okay, that's an issue, right? That's an internal email. And many of the emails that get architects into trouble are internal emails. Because when you're sending external emails, probably pretty careful with what's going out there. But internal emails, people are less cautious. If you use, or your office uses like Google Chat or Slack or anything like that, attorneys are now starting to ask for those records too, which has us very nervous because, again, you're guarded sending external emails, you're gonna be a little less guarded sending internal emails. And then what we found is on those chat features, it's sort of the wild, wild west. I mean, people are really shooting from the hip in there and putting things we definitely don't want to put in writing. So this first one, we don't have enough qualified professionals to staff this project. Typically, that's something you are committing to in your contract, is that you will staff the project with qualified professionals. Now, if we have a lawsuit, they come back, they have this email, and they say, look, you weren't even confident in your own people that you put on this project. Why should we have been confident in them? The next couple, we are embarrassed by our design errors. We are sorry we caused the problems on the project. Sounds crazy, but you'd be surprised how often we see this. Architects taking on liability by email before the dust has settled. And oftentimes it doesn't end up being the architect's issue, right? Maybe it's definitely the contractor's issue, but now we've put it in writing and it's hard to take that back. So I think the issue really is that architects for the most part are very nice people and typically problem solving people. And so if the client comes to you with a problem, your first instinct is to jump and say, we'll fix it, right? And that's great. You can say we'll fix it, but don't take on the liability. Don't say this is our fault before we figure it out. And certainly don't do it in writing because we can't take that back. We need to increase the value of these work scope variances as much as possible without getting caught. Obviously something you don't want to put in writing. Steve, I don't know if we have Steve here. Steve is an idiot. He is not qualified for this project. This is one that, again, it causes problems because now you're showing that you don't have confidence with the people you assigned to the project. And this can be internal, but we're seeing a lot with architects is with their subs, right? They are frustrated with the sub and they throw them under the bus in emails. And now they're your sub, if they're contracted to you, they cause a problem on the project. The owner's going to come back and say, look, in our contract, you said that you would staff the project with qualified consultants, or at least, it's assumed that the consultants you bring onto the project will be qualified. Now we have a trove of emails throwing this consultant under the bus. that's going to be a problem, and it's going to help them frame the narrative that you guys were not qualified to take on that project. We regret that your building experienced a catastrophic failure and collapse. We believe the cause of the failure is due to an engineering deficiency created by our design team. We apologize for this mistake and will do whatever it takes to fix this situation. So this is a really bad email. This is a circumstance where the architect was not feeling warm and fuzzy about a consultant because of another project that they were actually upset with them on, and they decided to throw them right under the bus on this project. Now, again, the issue here is you have to go through the architect on this to get to that sub. And so the architect ended up being sued here just to get to that sub. And again, it's difficult where they put in writing that this was on the design team. This was an engineering deficiency. The last line is something we definitely don't want to send. We'll do whatever it takes to fix this situation. If you're the owner, you're thinking that's a blank check, pretty much, right? No matter what it is, we'll fix the situation. So instead of emails like this, when a problem arises, it's best to tell the owner, we'll look into it, we'll circle up here, we'll take a look, and we'll get back to you. And if you think it's potentially, a real issue, contact us, open a loss prevention file. That way, behind the scenes, you can talk to an attorney and they can tell you this is kind of the best way to navigate this so this doesn't blow up into something bigger. All right, so with communication, just
Can I just
ask
a quick question about something that we've done with consultants, which is, is do peer reviews with like an external peer reviewing firm. Now, how does that kind of translate as a consultant? Because it's not necessarily directly like our engineer or our HVAC engineer or structural lever. They're here just as like another set of eyes. How would that translate into your liability for, let's just say, an errors and omissions or something like that?
Sure. And so are they contracted with you, and is it project specific, or is this one of the overall kind of firm peer reviews where they're looking at everything, a whole bunch of projects?
I mean, we've been doing it right now with one firm in particular with the contracts, the proposals are project to project, but we've used, and right now they have been contracted to us. I think there is a reimbursable to the client. It's something we've done on a couple of projects, mostly because they're complex and I just want another set of eyes on them, but be curious to understand how, because to me, that's like, you're getting another set of eyes on, which would be kind of best practices. But if there's still a problem, where does that lie? I mean, I guess, anyway, you can't tell me where it would lie then.
No, but oftentimes it's, by having that peer review, it doesn't increase your potential liability. It doesn't increase the risk on the project. If anything, for me, it decreases it, because what we see is that the earlier you can identify an issue on a project, the better, right? The earlier we can get at something, we can try to handle it, we can deal with it proactively. The more things drag on, then cost balloon, right? Things can be built over, then there's more, we need to do to go back and fix it. So to have another set of eyes there, I think it's a good thing. And if you obviously want to make sure you trust that firm, but having another set of eyes there, especially on projects that are more complex or projects that are a little outside of your comfort zone, that sort of thing, then I think it's a good idea. Because oftentimes, where we see firms get into claims is when they branch out a little bit, when they're doing projects that are bigger than they normally do, or in a different geographic location that are just different in terms of complexity that they normally do, then I think it's definitely a good idea to have that. And if anything, I think it would probably have an increase in terms of mitigating risk, in terms of keeping your liability lower, right? Because if they identify an issue, well, now we can fix it and move forward, rather than that issue going unidentified and it being noticed a year after construction or something like that, in which case we have a bigger problem. Awesome. All right, so with communication, don't hope that it will get better, especially in the single family residential world. I think, sometimes if you're in that world, you're doing, some people tell me it's 50% architecture, 50% marriage counseling. Some people say it's far more. marriage counseling, far less architecture, but the communication is really important. And sometimes you're dealing with clients in that world that are very inexperienced, that are only doing one project in their lifetime, and their expectations might be way out of whack. And if that's the case and you're starting to pick up on that, don't just hope it will get better. You have to have the tough conversations with them and tell them, look, your expectations are out of whack, right? We can't fast track this project while we're broadening the scope and do it for less money, right? That doesn't make sense. You have to talk to the clients and try to head things off before they become issues. And that's an issue for a lot of firms because everyone, rightfully so, is conflict averse, I think. So you don't want to have those tough conversations, but you really have to. And that's another part of engaging the insurance carrier earlier. If you're working with a client that is just, you can tell they're totally out there, their expectations are way too high, that's a problem, because a client that has expectations that are out of whack, you know, the standard of care might be here, right? You might perform here above the standard of care. But if the client, their expectations are well above where you perform, well, now we still have room for a claim there. And, you know, will that claim stick? Probably not, because you perform above the standard of care, but we'll still have to spend money on attorney's fees. You'll spend time on it. So it's really important to try to head off the communication issues. All right, we'll jump through the next ones fairly quickly. Construction phase services. The biggest thing we run into here is inappropriate documentation during the construction phase. Oftentimes it's photographs. So folks will go out to site during the construction phase. They will spin around in a circle, seemingly, take 540 photos, then they come back to their office, upload the photos to their computer. No one checks those photos. And now those photos are all there, right? Which now we have a claim on the project during the construction phase, something goes wrong. The other side, through the discovery process, is going to pull up all of those photos. And now we have 272 photos of the area at issue. Right, well, that's tough then for us because we have so many photos, we probably should have brought something up to head off the issue. We have a big claim on sort of like nursing home units in Ohio right now, where it's a bunch of units. The porches on each unit were built incorrectly. They're sloping slightly inwards towards the glass door when they should be sloping outwards. And it rains in Ohio, it snows a bit in Ohio. And so once this was constructed, we had residents getting a lot of water in through those glass doors. And the architect on the project, we got the claim in, they called us, they said, hey, this is pretty cut and dry, means and methods issue, right? This is the contract issue. Our drawings look good. Everything is fine. We said, great. So we move on to the discovery phase. And we figure out that they had people out, the architect had folks out on site, kind of a junior employee out there. And we have hundreds and hundreds of photos of those porches that are incorrect there. And it's fairly blatant. I mean, I'm not an architect, but I can see in the photos that it's incorrect, that the slope is the wrong way. And so at that point, now we really are just in the conversation of how much does the contractor pay versus how much does the architect pay. And so during the construction phase, that's one thing to really keep in mind is in terms of taking photographs, I always tell people either step way back, take a photo of the building, or get right up close to something, exactly what you're trying to take a photo of, because you get yourself into trouble in that middle area where you're just taking photos of an entire room, something like that, because the camera is catching things that you're not catching with your eye, essentially. So take photos of details or step all the way back. The other area with construction phase, and I think, Catherine, you touched on it earlier, is that sometimes clients will try to trim the construction phase or cut you off from the construction phase services. In those cases, I have some sample language that we use. You should always send them a release that says, you are cutting off our construction phase services. You need to release us from any and all liability stemming from that, right? If things are built incorrectly and we're not out there to check it, you can't come back to us. And again, sometimes the effect is they say, oh, okay, maybe we'll figure it out and we'll get you out there for CA. But if nothing else, we have that release if something does go wrong. All right, client selection. So this is a big one, especially in the residential world. In terms of selecting your clients, most clients, single family homeowners, they do one project in their lifetime. Most of them they work with probably never worked with an architect before. And though they have no idea what the standard of care is, they probably don't have a really good idea of an architect's responsibilities versus contractor's responsibilities versus a structural engineer's capabilities or responsibilities. So those inexperienced clients, they're a significant driver of claims because again, their expectations are out of whack. The other thing is it's personal to them, right? This is their home. They have oftentimes their life savings in that home. And so if there's issues, it hits them personally and they're more likely to file a claim, right? If you work on a commercial project for a big company, oftentimes they're just going to say, we're going to write the check because we need to get into this space by X time and we're not going to file a claim. It's not worth it for us and we have the money. For individuals, that's not usually the case because it is far more personal. So when you have a client that's inexperienced, like a single family homeowner, you got to take the time up front to really get in depth with them and explain to them, look, these are the phases that we're going to go through. This is what we will be performing. This is what we won't be doing, right? These are the contractor's responsibilities. These are your responsibilities. You got to have the conversation up front to try to educate them because an educated client is far less likely to file a lawsuit or a claim against you. Clients with a history of claims and litigation, we see people that sue architects tend to do it again and again. For individuals, single family homeowners, that's more difficult to know. Though we do sometimes run into the situation where an architect will call me and say, Cam, I got a great new project. It's about halfway through, right? There was an architect that got through design development, whatever it is, right? And now that architect is gone. They want us to take over the project. And I ask, that architect, did they retire or they, and it's, oh, no, they had a difference of opinions with the owner, right? And the owner fired them. All right, well, that's not a great project probably to step in on without asking some additional questions and really vetting that owner. I mean, far worse, sometimes we have the circumstance where an architect will say, they're actually in litigation with another architect, and we're going to take this over midstream. That's one of those projects where you definitely want to say no to that project. Again, what we see is if they've sued, they will do it again. And that goes for developers too. There's certain developers that are more trigger happy in terms of suing architecture firms. And a firm, you work with a certain developer, you see that they've sued another architect, then it's one you want to step back from. And I think, it's part of the client evaluation process. So even if you're looking at working for a new developer, right, ask the question, well, hey, they were doing all their projects with this other architect across town. Why did they stop, right? Let's call that architect and see what happened there potentially, because maybe there was a falling out, maybe there was an issue, maybe there was litigation, and you should know about that before moving forward, because it's definitely indicative of more claims to come. Poor financial condition, typically clients that don't have the money to finish a project, they know that the design team carries insurance, they will then go after the design team to essentially finish their project, to pay their project. Last one here, behind on payments. You want to avoid suing a client for fees pretty much at all costs. What happens if a client gets really behind on payments, you're bad on accounts receivable, there's that temptation to sue them to collect your fees. What we see is you sue a client to collect your fees, almost 100% of the time, they are going to countersue you for design negligence. Now you're paying one attorney to sue the client for fees, and you're paying another attorney through the insurance carrier to defend you from the design negligence claim. You almost never come out on top in those circumstances, right? You might collect the $50,000 in fees, but your insurance premiums are up for the next 5 years, and we paid, a $15,000 deductible. So you try to avoid that as much as you can by keeping up with those accounts receivable and having good payment terms that you stick to. Project team capabilities, we talked about this. This is really just having the right folks on the job internally and externally. So internally, making sure you take the time to train new staff, which does take a lot of time. And then externally, making sure you have subs you trust. It happens all the time where an architect working with a sub-consultant they've never worked with before runs into issues. And it's often just communication related issues like, hey, when we've done this in the past with this MEP, and they've included this. You guys didn't include it. We expected it to be included. Issues like that. So you really want to try to vet your sub-consultants as well. In terms of the project team, the last thing to consider is the contractor on the project. So the contractor is important because when you have a crummy contractor on a project, they do a bad job of constructing the building. Again, there's issues on the project. The client's going to sue everyone, right? The client talks to their attorneys. They're not going to say, we think it's the contractor. We should really just go after them, leave the design team out of it. No, they're going to say everyone has insurance. We'll sue everyone, and then we'll have everyone sit down, and then we'll get more money that way, essentially. So the thing there is to try to the extent you can, work with reputable contractors. And if it's a project where it's going to be the lowest of the low bid contractor or the only contractor that's not currently in prison, then that's a project maybe you don't want to take because it spells a lot higher risk for an architecture firm. All right. Quality control, the thing here, and this is different for every firm, and honestly for many projects, it's different, but it's having a procedure and sticking to it. So maybe your procedure is just before drawings go out, they always go by this principal's desk and they take the time to review it. Great. As long as you stick with that, that's your procedure. That's great. The difficulty there is when firms are busy, they start to fall down on doing the quality management. And that's where over the last couple of years, we started to see these claims tick up with firms just being inundated with work. Last one, contracts. We talked about this a few times. Things to hit on there. Standard of care for me, that's a deal breaker. They want to elevate the standard of care. That's not a client you want to work with. You should always be able to get that waiver of consequential damages, or almost always, right? If you're working on a really big project with a developer, maybe their attorneys aren't going to let you have it. A limitation of liability clause, that's something in the single family residential world, in my experience, you can almost always get that across. And that's a clause that just says, our liability for this project is limited to our fees or $50,000, whichever is greater, right? So no matter what you cause them damages, you're only on the hook for $50,000 or your fee. It's unrealistic on some larger projects, more sophisticated clients. But again, the single family world, what I've seen is folks have a really good success rate with getting that across. So I think it should certainly be in your terms and conditions. All right, now really quickly, I just want to show a couple more slides here in terms of the claims data. So when we look at claims experience between different disciplines here, the top bar is total fees that firms take in. The second bar is claims count, it's the amount of claims against those firms. And the third bar is claims dollars, what we pay out in terms of claims. And so architects overall are taking in the most fees. And with that, kind of in line in terms of the claims count and the claims dollars. Some of that is, again, they got to go through the architect to get to the sub-consultants. Civils, pretty in line, but the claims count and claims dollars are slightly higher than the fees. I'm always told that this one is wrong, that MEPs should be higher in terms of the claims count and claims dollars because they cause all the problems on projects. I'm waiting for the revised data right now as we go through it. And honestly, from what I've seen over the past couple of years, we have had a lot of MEP issues, so that may rise at this point. But the last time we ran this, surprisingly enough, it was lower in terms of their claims count versus their fees on a project.
One thought about that, and I think it was something I mentioned sort of earlier, is that we have a lot of projects where the MEP is design build to the builder. So there may be problems, but because it's design build, we don't end up involved.
And that may be the case. That may be driving that to be slightly lower. And it wouldn't be something that would be reported to, the professional liability carrier here if it's design built. Structurals and geotechs, as I said, these are high exposure areas in terms of claims. Structurals and geotechs pay much higher rates on their insurance because of that. And it's because the claims are severe, right? Overall, in terms of total fees we see come in on projects, only 6% go to structural, but they account for 9% of the claims dollars. Geotechs to fees, 2%, claims dollars, 6%. So they're outweighed a little bit there. And that's why I suggest those going directly if you can. All right, and these are the last two slides we'll look at. So in terms of just looking at your risk overall, in the residential world, as I said, you are in a higher risk area. So if we look at what we call relativity factors, we're looking at frequency of claims and severity of claims. Your baseline is an office project, an interior fit out of an office project. That's low risk one time, right? Roads and highways, a little bit up from there, schools, a little bit up from there. Then we get into the residential world. It's 6 times more likely to have a claim on a residential project than you are on an office fit out project. And more than that, condo projects, 25 times more likely to have a claim. We blow it up on the next slide just to scare everyone a little bit more in terms of the condos. But this is something that, you know, over the past, well, it's probably been 10 plus years now at this point, condos have sort of always been the boogeyman for the insurance carrier. It definitely hasn't gotten better in terms of that. And we see frequency on condo claims and severity. And one thing in terms of frequency is it's driven by, oftentimes you have a condo board. It's a group of people with no knowledge of the building industry, or even worse, sometimes they have tangential knowledge. They think they know what they're doing. When they don't know what they're doing, they work each other up. They start to file claims. The other thing too is in multi-unit buildings, you might be working on a condo building with 50 units, 100 units. Well, you've made an ADA mistake or an issue in one of the units, but now it's an issue in 50 units or 100 units, right? So those claims balloon into much larger amounts on those projects. So condos overall are a much higher liability area. Mostly where we see the risk is the bigger condo projects. If you're working on a one-off, one condo interior project for an individual owner, the risks are closer to that of an individual family, a homeowner, essentially too. But the condo projects are high risk and they affect your insurance rates significantly. I mean, they can, many carriers now are declining overall to even write companies with condos. So in Florida, it's an all-out disaster. After we had the Surfside condo collapse in Florida a couple of years ago, now insurance carriers down there, if your firm's doing more than 3% condo work, you have to go to the surplus lines market. We can barely find you coverage down there. Not so bad around here, but it's still the highest rating in terms of projects. So in terms of condo projects, proactive measures to take, make sure you get a really good contract on those projects, be even more strict in what you're looking for in your contracts on those projects, limitation of liability. Try to work with, if you're working with developers, reputable developers that have been in the space, that know what they're doing. You know, rookie developers, oftentimes we see more claims from them because it's their first rodeo. They haven't seen issues on other projects. And then so a small issue seems like a big issue to them. The other thing, and it kind of goes in line with that, is the contractor. You know, you want a good contractor on those projects too. All right, so we can wrap there. I think that's enough insurance talk probably for everyone for a couple of years.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you. That was very insightful, especially leaving that last slide up. To sink into our brains, sear it into our brains. I do have a question here from Eric Reinhardt. Eric, do you want to come on? Maybe not. Well, anyway, it's on the chat. It's about communication and being able to safely communicate internally about problems within a team, especially in a remote environment. Are there tips? Is there a way to communicate kind of off the record, or is that not? What is your guidance in terms of internal communication when a problem starts to emerge?
Yeah, so the biggest thing there is, my first recommendation is to get on the phone with people, to sort out, you know, sort of where you're at in the course of action on the phone first before you put anything in writing. You don't want to go through the problem solving process just emailing back and forth, because that's all in writing. Now, there's thresholds though too, right? I mean, on any project, there is the standard of care. We're expecting there to be some errors. We're expecting there to be changes throughout the project. And so if there's emails of you working through internal issues, right? You've identified conflicts in a sub-consultant, whatever it is, that's expected and that's okay. That's not going to cause problems. Where we see bigger issues is it's a bigger problem. And again, we're taking on responsibility internally before it's clear if we should. So honestly, the first thing to do once you get a word of potential issue is call the folks on your team, get a conference call together, talk about it and see where you're at. And if you think it's potentially a larger issue and you don't have a solid course of action, then talk to us. The other thing I would say is always document solutions rather than documenting the problem or the blame on someone, right? Instead of documenting, pinning it on a certain consultant, pinning it on an individual, document solutions, right? We're glad, you've identified this. I think these are the best steps going forward. You're not taking liability there. You're just documenting solutions, thinking of how you can finish, the project correctly. So the phone is key though, as I would say. It's a depressing way to think about things, but unfortunately, whenever you send an email, you want to be thinking, would I be prepared to have this email, put in front of me during a mediation or a deposition or in court? And if you're not there yet, don't send the email. Pick up the phone, talk to someone, work through it, and then document the solutions rather than the problem.
I'd like to open it to questions. So does anybody have a specific question related to residential liability? I'm sure we can all think of a situation where we've kind of wiped our brow because we've missed a speeding train coming at us. I guess part of my question is going forward, so I think we all do condo work, especially those of us who work in Boston, Back Bay, South End, downtown. That's all there really is. And so as you start to work with a client, what are some checks that we have to make sure are in place to limit our liability or exposure as we start to take on these projects?
Yeah, and so if you're working with an individual client, their specific condo unit, or it's a building, right, and there's 3 condo units, something in there, that's a much lower risk. You can sort of evaluate them as you would a single family homeowner. You still want to get their level of experience. The other thing you want to look at when you're doing a single unit is the neighbors, right? I asked the question, how's the relationship with the neighbors? Do they know you're going to be doing this work? Are they okay with you
Do it all
doing
the time.
Right. And because that can potentially spell issues, right? That's a third party claimant that could be upset by the fact that they're doing this construction work. So on an individual basis, you kind of take the same steps you do with a homeowner. Try to figure out their experience, try to figure out what their understanding is in terms of what they're looking for and what they're expecting out of their architect. And then on bigger projects or some of those really large projects, that again, and this goes for both actually, is you got to be really careful to nail down a good contract on those, because the reality of the situation is we see more claims on condo projects, probably always going to see more claims on those condo projects. And so nailing down a good contract is even more important. The other thing is having long-term relationships on those. If this is a developer or company you've worked with many times, well, if you've worked with them 25 times, they're far less likely to sue you on the 26th time. They're probably, going to work with you on it. Those first-time clients, you want to be more wary of. You want to evaluate them up front, get their level of comfort. You got to figure out if they're, are they the developer and also the contractor? There's the elevated risk there because they're going to be cutting costs then probably during the construction phase because it's their bottom line at the end of the day, and that can spell potential issues. So on condo projects, it really is a case-by-case basis. I would say be really careful with the contract, do your best to do your homework on the client, ask the uncomfortable questions up front. I mean, honestly, I think you can ask the question, have you sued an architect before when you have a new client? Oftentimes when you're going after a project, they'll want to know if you've been sued before, if you've had claims. So I think it's an okay question to ask, but that's what you have to do. Do your homework on the individual, because when we look at claim statistics, something like 85% of the time architects get sued, they get sued by their client, right? It's a very small amount of the time, it's a third party. So the biggest thing you can do is evaluate that client up front. What are their capabilities? What are their motivations? And that's probably going to insulate you the most. And then the contract. Always send us over the contracts, take a look at it, and we can have the discussion based on the size, the scope of the project, what's appropriate to push for and kind of be hardline on in those contracts. Because you got to do the work. As you said, that's a lot of what's out there. You can't just leave that entirely, and I understand that.
Can you talk a little bit about site documentation? You go out to a site visit, what should we, and the difference, we talk about inspection versus observation or general conformance. And so what should our notes be? What should we be writing down? You talked a little bit about the photography, things like that, but what should we be looking for? I was at a site yesterday and doors were put in backwards and electric plan wasn't followed. So
So that's,
and I can't be the only one that's run into this situation. So
no, and that stuff you definitely want to document, and you want to document the specific issues, right? So you don't want to just have your notes say, quote unquote, shoddy construction. Because now we have a claim and we go back and say, well, we noted shoddy construction, but what does that even mean, right? What was that specifically? But if you go out there and the doors are incorrect, you want to note this door was not installed in accordance with the design documents, right? This door was not, the electrical was not. So you want to be specific in those, because now if there are issues in a claim, we're going to go back to those notes and you're going to say, well, we brought this up to you, right? This is not our issue. In terms of what not to document while you're out there, you want to be careful about graying the line in terms of means and methods and job site safety, especially. So you never want to, if you see, a potential safety issue on a project, that's not your responsibility, but, notify the contractor, notify the supervisor on site, but definitely be careful in terms of, you don't want to be dictating any sort of safety issues or contractors' means and methods issues. You also don't really want to be governing how the contractor does things, right? You can come after the fact and look and say, this is in conformance with design documents, or it's not in conformance, but you shouldn't be out there really giving instructions throughout the process, I guess, to the contractor, because again, that starts to gray the line in terms of your responsibilities. So for me, it's, you want to be specific on the issues that you see, on the issues that you note. That way we have the protection back there. And what you don't want to do is the same case with the photos, is just have these sort of catch-all things, right? Shoddy construction, or we just have a bunch of photos, but there's no details in the photos. We're not close up to anything. It's just kind of overall, because that gives us nothing to fall back on in an issue. So definitely try to be as detailed as possible and make those notes, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to save you, is having those notes.
Well, you mentioned, and I'm sorry, I apologize to everyone. I just was like leaping in with my questions rather than putting them in the chat. So my apologies. But you mentioned this idea of consequential damages, or what I would have called in past life, like liquidated damages. But so in this market for the past, whatever, 2 years, I mean, construction, the schedules have just gone haywire. And a lot of that is stuff that's, we might have gotten the drawings out when we were expected to get the drawings out, but the contractor's been delayed by, whatever it is, a million and one things. I guess the question then is, if we've got the clause in the contract, and I actually don't know that I have it in my contract, I'm going to need to check that. How much of that comes down to like documenting stuff on site, which is like, we were here and something hadn't been done yet, Like, are we exposing ourselves if we're not, say, documenting the fact that we're trying to keep things moving, but the contractor's behind schedule for things that may not be his fault, but put him in the hot seat on that problem rather than us?
Yeah, and you don't necessarily, right, you don't need to blame the contractor straight up, but you do need to document the fact that, hey, we're up to date essentially, or where we should be, but these are delays that are happening right now. And so the important things to have in your contract, to actually not, I mean, that consequential damages waiver is great to have in your contract for that, but there's a couple other things. You ideally want to have a clause in your contract concerning timeliness, and tying timeliness to the standard of care, saying that you will perform the project in a timely manner in line with the prevailing standard of care, right? The thing that clients will often put in their contracts is they will say time is of the essence for this contract, or you must meet the schedule. Well, that's a problem, because then that's essentially a guarantee, and you're guaranteeing things that are outside of your control. So timeliness clause is one thing to have in there. The other thing to have in there is a delays clause. So a clause in there that pretty much says the architect will not be responsible for any delays caused by things outside of their reasonable control, right? Things that you can't control, delays in materials coming, contract delays, those are all outside of your control. And so you want to have in your contract that you won't be responsible for that. Those are probably the two best contractual protections there. And then, of course, you want to have the consequential damages too, because if there is a delay claim, then that would balloon it there.
Are these things, Cam, that if we sent our terms and conditions and contracts to you, if you're our agent, that you would help us review?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's simple, adding that stuff in for sure. So,
Yeah.
you want to send that over, I can definitely take a look.
Well, we're coming up on the half hour. I think this has been great. Cam, I think I'm going to talk to you about maybe a future presentation that is more about the do's and don'ts as a follow-up
fun one.
presentation, kind of where the rubber meets the road. But this has been very insightful. I mean, this is a huge, we all want to do the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing gets us in trouble. So I think being professional, we have to know where the lines are and where we have to draw those lines and have our boundaries. The one last thing I want, this is more kind of some levity here, is I have the honor of being married to an attorney.
So do I.
And
So do I.
not in the real estate world, but I'll sometimes pick his brain about, how I should be thinking about a situation. And 9 times out of 10, he just lifts up his head from watching TV and says, what does the contract say? What does the contract say? And so it just, after about the 10th time of him saying that, it really is important to have that contract in place. And a slow learner on my end, but I've stopped asking the question, because that's the first question, is what does the contract say?
Absolutely, yeah. And
So get your
also-
signed contracts, everybody.
get them signed. And I'll say too, regardless of whether you work with our office or not, if you have questions afterwards, you think of something, you can shoot me an email, give me a call. All my info is on the website, or you have it. Or if you just want me to look at your contract, send it over. We'll take a look and see if we can beef it up a little bit.
Wonderful. Thanks for your time, Cam. We really appreciate it. And everyone, enjoy the rest of the snow day, or the day that has snow. I shouldn't say we're working. It's not a snow day.
Sure. All right. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Until next time.